And welcome back to the final hour of Green Mountain Mornings on WKVT 100.3 FM, AM 1490. It is 36 degrees outside, 8:14 on the clock. After the break, I will be speaking with Mike Faher from Vermont Digger and the Reformer. I also have Nolan, hello Nolan, who's in the studio today filming for BCTV, so you can catch this segment later at their website, brattleboro.tv.org. Welcome back to Green Mountain Mornings on WKVT 100.3 FM, AM 1490. 36 degrees outside, 8:21 on your Tuesday, November 14th. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I have in the studio with me Mike Faher. Welcome, Mike.
Glad to be here.
And we have a lot to talk about. We have a very long list of news. But let's just quickly, because we haven't really talked about it much since the vote on November 7th, what are the next steps for Act 46 now that the vote has come in not in favor of it, a no vote?
Yeah, this was sort of an education for me too. It appears to me that what the rule is that by December 26th, which is not all that far out, someone has to submit to the state an alternative governance plan. Okay, so the first school merger in these four towns failed. So here's what we want instead. The interesting thing is that according to the information that I've seen from the State Agency of Education, it's unclear, I should say it's clear that there could be multiple proposals now submitted to the state. For instance, Brattleboro School Board could come up with a plan that's completely different from Dummerston's plan. And if they don't get together to sort of reconcile those, they could simply send up alternative governance plans to the state. And then the state has to figure all that out. Furthermore, apparently there's been this alternative governance group that's been meeting in case the vote failed, which it did. And it appears there's no specific provision in the law that would prevent that group, even though it's not technically a school board, from submitting a plan to the state. All this is on such an accelerated time frame, and it feels after the sort of rigorous structure of the almost 2 years of merger study that we had, this feels almost like just a mad scramble.
I think that's a good characterization, yeah.
But, I should note that whatever's submitted to the state at the end of this year doesn't have to be all nailed down, final plan. As I understand it, the state Secretary of Education will then work with whatever group has come forward with an alternative governance plan to tweak it, to try to make it something that works for the local folks, but also for the state, because ultimately, can't forget that ultimately the state decides.
Right.
If they don't like the plan, they don't have to approve it. And then by around this time next year, they'll just come up with their own plan. So there's, as everyone involved already knows, I don't have to tell them this, it's pretty high stakes.
Yeah, and that's something that we probably shouldn't forget either, is that the state and the legislature went through and created Act 46 with its goals, with its findings, whether you like them or not, whether you agree with them or not. They are something that they are goals that the state wants to reach.
Yeah.
Through this Act 46. And at the end of the day, the state's going to make sure those goals are reached.
That's the way it stands right now. I mean, we do have a legislative session between, it starts in January, and so theoretically, I guess it's possible that something could get yet again tweaked in Act 46. Maybe they extend the timelines for mergers one more time.
Mm-hmm.
It was extended in the last session. You have to wonder, though, at some point, they've passed the law and they've changed the law, and you've got school boards all around the state, whether they're for or against Act 46,
Mm-hmm.
scrambling to comply with the law.
Right.
I don't know. At some point, they've got to leave it alone and let people do the work.
And move forward with the process, whatever that may
Yeah.
turn out to be. So thank you, Mike. It's kind of a hurry up and wait scenario.
It is, but I don't envy the superintendent of Wyndham Southeast now has to sit down with each of her school boards, including, I should say, possibly Vernon, because Vernon wasn't part of the first merger, but they could be part of some sort of alternative governance structure that allows them to retain their school choice. So we might have a fifth town back in the mix, and she's got to sort of try to sort all this out. What do we want in Wyndham Southeast, and can we find consensus? Because it also has to go back to the voters again, whatever we come up with.
Oh, really?
I believe so.
Okay. Well, that would make sense.
I should qualify that by saying we're so late in the process. I think that's the case. I'm still learning about this as I go. So
and the timelines do feel like they keep shifting. Just for listeners, just so they know, we have missed a couple timelines for some other votes. So we may have missed this final timeline. We don't know yet.
I have to say, and I don't mean to pronounce judgment on Act 46, but when that law was passed 2 years ago, it's pretty clear to me, just as a reporter, that the state was not ready. And they put out, sort of guidelines that were not clear or half-baked and then were changed. And then, of course, as I say, the legislature went in and changed the law last year. And so if you're a school board member, you have to feel to some extent like the ground's been shifting under your feet throughout this entire process. And it's extremely difficult for school boards.
I'll echo that point because I remember when Act 46 first came out, going through some of the initial documentation that the state released as a reporter and having to call up a bunch of people and say, what exactly am I reading?
No question about that. In fact, I remember talking to the then superintendent in Wyndham Southeast, Ron Staley, and Ron's interpretation of the law and some of the timelines were different from what the Agency of Education were putting out. And so everybody was starting to sort of frantically work on this without really knowing exactly how to go about it. And it feels to me like there's still a little bit of that. And so now we've got this sort of Wild West atmosphere of all these alternative governance proposals are going to be flying up to the state agency of education. And, not to get too far into the weeds, but you have to wonder if they have the resources to look at them all and figure them out.
And to understand the communities they're coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that's one thing that was promised through Act 46 was the law did try to acknowledge that every community is different. And therefore, the merger needs to reflect its unique community. And we don't know that the state will be able to recognize that, because why would they? If you're not part of a community, how would you understand its uniqueness?
Well, and ultimately, as I noted before, at the end of this, there's a very blunt instrument, which is the State Board of Education coming up with its own plan for the districts that haven't merged, and that's a monumental task.
That is. So we will, just quickly before we go to the bottom of the hour break, there is some bridge work ahead for the county.
Yeah, just quickly, there's another bridge project coming up on I-91 in Windham County. We've seen a lot of those. Brattleboro just finished a $60 million project, or I should say a project was finished in Brattleboro. A $44 million project happening in Rockingham on I-91 as we speak. And as soon as that's done, maybe not quite when it's done, there'll be a $10 million project on I-91 in Westminster, a replacement or a repair project. So you can pretty much get used to the orange cones and one-lane travel for the foreseeable future.
And part of the reason for this is that all these bridges were built about the same time. And they were showing the same wear and tear.
Yes, almost, very similar in design, and they've all seen the same amount of road salt. And so VTrans is just dealing with a lot of deteriorated bridges. I was surprised to learn, just as a trivia note, that this bridge they're talking about working on in Westminster, I believe, is Bridge 21. And what that means is between the Massachusetts-Vermont border and the mile marker 30, I guess it is, there's 21 bridges.
Wow.
Which you wouldn't think about when you're driving over them. And,
Right.
and that gives you some idea of how many bridges, just in Windham County, that VTrans has to deal with on I-91.
And we are back to Green Mountain Mornings on WKVT 100.3 FM, AM 1490. 37 degrees outside, 8:38 on the clock. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I have in the studio, welcome back, Mike Faher.
Here we are.
Here we are. And we are going to talk about something that you've been covering for a while, but just you haven't really talked about on the show, and that's alimony reform.
Yeah, it's such a weird topic in a sense. It's not the kind of thing that, we cover a lot of local governance issues as local reporters. We do, but this is it's an interesting policy issue, but it's also a very emotional policy issue. Alimony, divorce.
Yeah.
There's just inevitably emotion involved, and I've tried to be careful in covering it to not get too far into individual stories and cases, because inevitably, almost inevitably, there is another side to that story.
Right.
But basically what we have is a Brattleboro-based group, Vermont Alimony Reform, made up of alimony payers who feel that, both men and women, I should note, who feel that the state's laws are antiquated and not fair, and they allow too much judicial discretion. And so you have no idea what the outcomes will be. And they also, I should say, well, some of the group's goals is that they want to end what they call indefinite alimony, just sort of open-ended alimony payments. They want to provide for an alimony payer to be able to retire. They also, and this is the most controversial one, they'd like to see alimony payments end when a recipient either cohabitates or remarries. And so there's a task force that the state legislature created that's looking at this. They're actually going to issue a report next month, and they had a hearing last week at Vermont Law School. And as you might expect, there were lots of alimony reformers there, and they had buttons and they had signs, and they really they had their act together.
Okay.
But there was also several folks who were opposed to some of these measures, most notably the Vermont Commission on Women.
Interesting, because a lot of people have acknowledged that Vermont's alimony laws do need some tweaking, but the Vermont Commission on Women kind of highlighted some of the gender inequality that still exists around funding and money and.
Yeah, they point out, the vast majority of alimony recipients are women. And they point out that there are some good reasons to not do what the reformers would like to do, at least from their point of view. For instance, going back to the ending alimony when a recipient cohabitates or remarries. On one hand, you can see where that might make economic sense for payers. They're sitting there saying, well, gee, I've been writing this check. Now my ex-wife, my ex-husband in some cases, is remarried with another income in the household. Why should I be writing that same check?
Very good argument.
You can get that. On the other hand, the Vermont Commission on Women points out that, on one hand, they feel like it's a social issue in that essentially what you're allowing to happen there is the payer to almost kind of control the romantic life of the recipient. There might be some disincentive for a recipient to enter into a long-term relationship, cohabitate, remarry, if in fact there's going to be an economic impact to that.
Right.
And they also point out that in their view, alimony can be compensatory, and they say that because oftentimes women leave the workforce temporarily or permanently to have and raise children. And if down the road a divorce occurs, that woman then does not have the same kind of retirement savings, Social Security, payment that the man has. And therefore, why should alimony end at retirement if, in fact, the ex-wife is in a very precarious economic situation because of what she did and the sacrifices she made during the marriage? I haven't explained that very well, but the point is that there's some concern that what the reformers want could unfairly impact women.
Right.
And so now this task force and then ultimately the legislature has to figure this out. What's fair?
And when you covered that hearing, did folks who are on the task force or in the legislature give any thoughts or feedback to what they had just heard?
No, it was very much a listening session. There's a couple of judges on that task force, and they don't tend to pontificate very much. At least
Right.
in this case, they did, and it was very much, here we are, sign up and speak, and it was very regimented, and a lot of people spoke in about 90 minutes.
Okay.
I think there were more than 50 people jammed into a classroom at
Wow.
Vermont Law School that was, quite frankly, not anywhere near big enough for the event.
Okay.
But I thought there were some really compelling arguments on both sides. I mean, I don't want to give short shrift to the payers' concerns. There was one gentleman there who's approaching age 85. He's got an alimony payment that he cannot have reduced. The judges have, for whatever reason, not reduced it. And he said it's the alimony payment and some related bank loans are at this point, I think, like 70% of his monthly income.
Wow.
And he said, I'm just about running out of assets to sell. And of course, what happens if, quite rightly so, I guess, under the law, if you don't make your payment, you're in contempt of court,
Right.
which can then lead to more trouble. And I think what the reformers say is, look, we think that there's very convincing arguments that at the very least there needs to be less judicial discretion in alimony cases. There needs to be more predictable outcomes. And if there are, that could lead to less messy court battles and less messy divorces because the two sides will have a better idea of how things are going to turn out.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, I going back to the emotional aspect of it, there was one woman who testified, and if I understood her correctly, she showed up because she was on the Vermont alimony reform website and saw a story by her ex and sort of hotly disputed, the contentions on this website. So it just shows that it's very easy to get into very deep-seated emotional, familial conflict here.
Yeah.
And
There's a reason the marriages broke apart in the first place.
people years later, decades later, are still very deeply hurt. And that makes this sort of policy issue so much harder to sort out.
Well, thank you for that, Mike. I look forward to seeing the report when it comes out, next month?
Yeah, early December they have to issue a report, and then of course the legislature, I assume, would take up the issue in the new session.
So take us over to Vermont Yankee in the last few minutes we have.
Yeah, the inevitable Vermont Yankee update. So the latest the documents, I guess, that I've uncovered in that case is that the state Public Utility Commission, which is trying to consider whether or not Vermont Yankee should be sold from Entergy to North Star, there's so much evidence in that case and so much testimony that they'd like to hire a consultant, an advisor, to help them sort through it and figure it out. Apparently, there's some precedent for this, but it's sort of an indicator, I think, of how complicated this Vermont Yankee case is. And this consultant, they say, is going to cost between $50,000 and $100,000, and the state is saying they're going to charge Entergy and North Star for that price. So Entergy is objecting to this, and interestingly, it's not because of the cost, but they feel like the role of this consultant would be way too broad, and they're concerned that the consultant will sort of come to conclusions and sort of communicate them to the state Public Utility Commission without North Star or Entergy having a chance to vet those opinions and figure out or have a chance to rebut them. So, it's just another example, I guess, of how with almost every aspect of this case, someone is at odds with someone else.
Well, I do find Entergy's argument compelling because as a state, the state is beholden to a certain level of transparency.
Yes, and that's one of their key arguments. That, this consultant apparently would be able to review the evidence in the Vermont Yankee case, advise the PUC, but not ever testify or file testimony. And Entergy is saying, well, how do we know what conclusions this consultant has come up with, and why wouldn't we have a chance to rebut them? And so, Entergy has filed its objections. North Star has a few objections, and ultimately, then the PUC will decide, okay, are we going to listen to any of this? If we hire our consultant, will we change that person's role? Another thing that I haven't been able to determine is who the heck is this person? Is it someone who has a history of activism on one side of the issue or the other?
Good point.
And that's another concern of Entergy's. How do we know this person can be impartial?
Mm-hmm. And so what's the next step? It sounds like they're in the holding pattern of filing court documents at this point.
Well, yeah, as with everything with this case, everything's in process. But at some point, it's got to come to an end. And we're already in November. And the last public hearing on this from the Public Utility Commission's standpoint is going to be in Vernon in early January.
Mm-hmm.
And then theoretically, at some point, I guess in the first quarter of 2018, they might issue some kind of ruling. That's where the NRC is at right now. They're looking at the first quarter of 2018. The longer this drags on, the more uncertainty there remains for Entergy and North Star, because they want to get this deal closed by the end of next year. And even though that's a year out, one can imagine that they would very much like to have some more certainty in the near future than they've got right now.
And that's the thing that's so easy to forget, because this process has been going on for so long, is basically North Star wants to buy VY. And that's a business transaction. Yeah,
and it's a business transaction that's been in the works for years. It's something they announced over a year ago. And this is not at all to I'm not casting any aspersions on the state or the federal review, but it is a long road.
Right.
And it's one that I don't think North Star, in terms of the state process, they have never participated in anything like this before. It's very new to them. Mm-hmm. And I think that they've had to learn as they go.
Right.
And, ultimately, there's either going to be a deal or North Star could walk away. Mm-hmm. And that's not, I think that's a fact. They've said that. Mm-hmm. So we'll, I think the next couple of months, the next 3-4 months are just absolutely critical for this deal.
Well, thank you, Mike. That's all the time we have for today, but I look forward to having you back in the studio.